One game, that's all it took. 90 minutes into the 2026 World Cup, and the tournament had already claimed its first victim, gone. A manager hired to lead his country through the biggest competition in football was out before his team had even played a second match. And that's what makes this story so strange. Because if you look at the headlines, it feels like a classic overreaction, a bad defeat, a frustrated federation, a panic decision. But the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to believe that. Because this wasn't a coach losing his job after one match. This looked a lot more like a coach losing his job weeks before the tournament even started. The official ending just happened to arrive in front of the entire world. It started in Monterrey, Tunisia against Sweden, a match that quickly stopped looking competitive and started looking like a warning sign. Sweden didn't just win, they dismantled Tunisia. 5 goals, 1 response. A 5-1 scoreline that immediately became one of the most painful World Cup defeats in Tunisian history. Every attack seemed dangerous. Every defensive mistake seemed punished. Every moment Tunisia tried to recover, Sweden found another way through. Alexander Isak struck, Victor Gyökeres got involved, Matthias Svanberg added to the damage, and by the end, Tunisia looked completely overwhelmed. But even that wasn't the detail everyone kept talking about afterward, because the most brutal moment came from a player whose story made the entire night feel almost scripted. Yassine Ayari scored twice, and that mattered for a reason bigger than football. Ayari's father was born in Tunisia. Think about that. On the biggest stage in world football, a player with family roots connected to Tunisia delivered 2 of the goals that helped bury Tunisia's World Cup hopes. You could not have written a more painful opening chapter if you tried. And after the final whistle, Tunisia manager Sabri Lamouchi looked like a man already carrying the weight of something much larger than a single defeat. His message was simple. Tunisia were hurting themselves. They were, in his own words, shooting themselves in the foot. The problem? Within 24 hours, he was gone. And that's where the real story begins. Because firing a coach after one World Cup match sounds completely insane. Until you start looking behind the curtain, then it starts looking inevitable. Before the World Cup even began, alarm bells were already ringing. Lamouchi's results were poor, very poor. His team had managed just 1 win in 5 matches. 1, that's it. A narrow victory over Haiti. Everything else painted a much darker picture. There was a defeat against Austria. Then came the result that reportedly terrified people inside Tunisian football. A 5-0 demolition against Belgium. No excuses, no controversy, just complete domination. And when officials looked at those preparation matches, they saw something deeply worrying. Tunisia weren't just losing, they weren't scoring. Goals dried up, confidence disappeared. The team looked increasingly disconnected. The World Cup defeat against Sweden wasn't the first sign of trouble, it was the confirmation. But results alone rarely cause this kind of reaction. Federations tolerate bad performances all the time, especially before major tournaments. So why did this situation move so quickly? Because results weren't the only problem. Trust was becoming a problem too. Watch the Sweden match closely and one moment stands out. In the 72nd minute, defender Jan Valeri was substituted. What happened next immediately caught attention. His frustration was impossible to hide. The cameras picked it up. The body language said everything. This wasn't the image of a united squad fighting through adversity. This looked like a relationship breaking apart in real time. And when players stop believing in a manager during a World Cup, every hour suddenly becomes dangerous. But even that wasn't the most uncomfortable issue surrounding Lamouchi, because reports began highlighting a growing dispute between the coach and the federation itself. A dispute that had nothing to do with tactics, nothing to do with formations, nothing to do with Sweden. It centered around trust. During preparations, Lamouchi reportedly brought his son into the team's secure training environment. The federation wanted answers. Questions were asked. Explanations were demanded, and suddenly a situation that appeared football-related started looking institutional. The problem was no longer simply whether Tunisia could win matches. The problem became whether everyone inside the organization was still operating on the same page. And once that happens, defeats become much more dangerous, because every loss turns into evidence. Every mistake becomes ammunition. Every criticism gains credibility. The Sweden result didn't create the crisis. It detonated it, and what happened next pushed the story into completely new territory, because football has seen fast dismissals before. Very fast dismissals, but not like this. Go back through World Cup history. You can find managers who survived terrible defeats. You can find coaches who lasted multiple matches despite obvious disaster. You can find federations desperately trying to avoid making emotional decisions. In 1998, Tunisia dismissed Henrik Kasperczak. But not after one game, after two. That extra match mattered. South Korea dismissed Cha Bum-kun during the same tournament. Again, after multiple setbacks, not one. Then there's one of the most famous examples ever. Spain in 2018. Julen Lopetegui lost his job just before the World Cup after secretly agreeing to join Real Madrid. That was an institutional earthquake. But even then, the dismissal happened before the tournament began, not after 90 minutes of football. That's what makes this different. Almost a century of World Cup history, 96 years, countless controversies, countless disasters, countless humiliations, and yet nobody had ever produced this exact sequence. One match, one defeat, one dismissal, Lamouchi became the first. And suddenly another uncomfortable question emerged. What does that say about Tunisia? Because this wasn't happening in isolation. The federation had already shown a willingness to act aggressively. Managers were not being given much time. Patience was disappearing. The margin for error looked smaller than ever. Lamouchi had signed what was supposed to be a long-term project, a contract stretching years into the future. Instead, it lasted only months. 5 months. Think about that. A long-term vision that barely survived a single season. And that's when the story took another turn, because Tunisia didn't just remove a manager, they immediately turned toward one of football's most recognizable crisis specialists, Hervé Renard. The silver hair, the white shirt, the intense stare on the touchline. Renard has built an entire reputation around walking into difficult situations and somehow finding a way out. Not comfortable situations, not stable situations, broken situations, the kind where confidence is gone and expectations are collapsing, which is exactly why his arrival instantly changed the conversation, because suddenly this wasn't a story about a firing, it became a story about a rescue mission, and Renard's history explains why. This will be his third consecutive World Cup with 3 different nations. That alone is unusual. Most coaches spend years trying to reach one World Cup. Renard keeps arriving with different teams, different cultures, different challenges, and yet the achievement everyone remembers happened in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, Lionel Messi, one of the biggest shocks in World Cup history, a result nobody saw coming, a result that transformed Renard into something more than a coach. It transformed him into a symbol, the manager capable of producing chaos when chaos seems impossible. Which is exactly what Tunisia now needs. Because let's be honest, changing managers is easy, changing everything else is not. The dressing room problems don't disappear overnight. The confidence issues don't disappear overnight. The tactical weaknesses don't disappear overnight. And time is the one thing Renard doesn't have. The World Cup doesn't wait. The schedule keeps moving. The pressure keeps building. The next opponents are coming whether Tunisia is ready or not. And that's where this story becomes bigger than one manager, bigger than one federation, bigger than one defeat. Because every World Cup creates moments where pressure exposes what was already hidden. Weak foundations, internal conflicts, broken relationships, poor decisions, problems nobody wanted to discuss when results were acceptable. Then one bad night arrives, and suddenly everything comes crashing into public view. That's exactly what happened here. The world saw a 5-1 defeat, but the defeat was only the visible part. Underneath it sat months of tension, frustration, declining results, questions about authority, questions about trust, and questions about whether the project was already collapsing before the opening whistle. Now Tunisia has handed the situation to a man famous for surviving chaos. The question is whether even he has enough time, because Japan is waiting, the Netherlands are waiting, and the World Cup has already shown it has no patience. Was this a ruthless correction that saved Tunisia before things became even worse? Or was it a panicked decision that revealed just how unstable the situation had become? Nobody knows yet. What we do know is this: the 2026 World Cup needed only 90 minutes to produce its first casualty, and if the pressure is already breaking managers after a single game, there's a very real possibility that this won't be the last collapse we witness before the tournament is over.